if the Bennet family had caught COVID, you could be certain that all of Meryton would be infected within a week. Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm Claudia and today I want to talk about Jane Austen in lockdown. Specifically, I want to talk about lots of popular articles online that I've seen over the past year that compare Jane Austen novels with our current situation. Every few months I come across an article that says something like, being in lockdown has made me appreciate Jane Austen's heroines much more. And the idea of these articles is that the way we live our lives right now and the way that we've been living our lives for the past year, mainly staying indoors and avoiding contact with people, is somehow how Jane Austen's characters lived their lives. And I guess by extension, people have this idea that that's how Jane Austen lived her life as well. Just recently there was a story that was in the Telegraph, in the Tatler and in the Times. I'll link the three articles in the description box, although two of them are behind a paywall. And that article was about domestic hobbies and the rise in domestic hobbies, such as embroidery and crochet, and again tying that back to Jane Austen's novels. Last year in April there was an article in The Guardian which also compared lockdown life with the life of Jane Austen's heroine, etc. And I'm reading these articles by people claiming that they feel just like Lizzie Bennet while stuck at home, thinking, have they read a different novel? Are we talking about the same books here? Because Lizzie Bennet and Anne Elliot and Marianne Dashwood, they did not social distance. They did not lock down. They did not remain in their homes, not talking to anyone for the majority of the book. Quite the opposite. Lizzie Bennet was not social distancing. Lizzie Bennet was at a party or a ball or some other event in the neighborhood every weekend. Lizzie Bennet traveled and met people and danced and socialized. It's the exact opposite of my life right now, really. If the Bennet family had caught COVID, you could be certain that all of Meryton would be infected within a week. So why do we think that Jane Austen's novels are lockdown narratives when really they are quite the opposite? I think some of it is to do with this idea of domesticity and Jane Austen as a domestic writer. And what we think we mean when we say that is someone whose stories take place within homes. So this is from Josephine Tovey, and she wrote this in The Guardian last April. In these stories, people's lives are shaped by domestic confinement and social inhibition. Lives are lived on top of each other. Domestic confinement, I just cannot agree with. Because as I've said, most of the characters, in fact all of Jane Austen's heroines, travel at one point or another out of their homes. They're certainly not confined to their homes, to their own drawing rooms. And social inhibition is not the same as social isolation and social distancing. So I think Josephine Tovey must have missed all of the dancing that happened in Jane Austen. There's another article by Judith Armstrong in The Conversation, and she talks about sense and sensibility and about the sisters having to move out of their home into this strange, new, more modest cottage. So she writes, "It is this move that puts the sisters in a situation that has parallels with ours. The tiny village of Barton could offer no social life. A little like people obliged to work from home, the girls found themselves with no external stimuli other than nature, with which to fuel their inner thoughts and mutual exchanges. Thrown back on their own resources then, the two older sisters work on their existing accomplishments. Eleanor sketches and paints, Marianne practices her piano playing. They walk daily, sew and read." Are we talking about the same novel? Because I distinctly remember Marianne Dashwood complaining about having too much of a social life in the new cottage. She doesn't like that she's expected to constantly go for dinner with the neighbours and have them come over. So rather than social isolation, there is too much socialising going on for her tastes in the novel. And rather than playing the piano because she has nothing else to do and no one else to talk to, she wishes she could stay at home and play the piano more rather than constantly hanging out with the family next door. Jane Austen's novels are not about social distancing. They are about socialising. Socialising is the heartbeat of every Jane Austen novel. And while these social events happen within people's homes. They don't happen within the protagonists' homes. In fact, Jane Austen's travel are, to some degree, all about traveling and about movement and about physically moving out of your comfort zone and finding yourself in new surroundings. For example, Northanger Abbey has two distinct settings, Bath and Northanger Abbey, but the home of our main character, Catherine Morland, is barely mentioned. There's very little of the book that actually takes place there. The vast majority of Northanger Abbey is set in surroundings that are new to our main character. In Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth goes and visits her friend Charlotte in Kent. She then travels to Derbyshire with her aunt on a holiday. Her sisters travel as well. Jane spends time in London and Lydia travels to Brighton. But even when the characters are in their home, when they are at Longbourn, they never stay inside of their home for long. Elizabeth goes to the nearby town of Meryton on a regular basis to visit her friends and relatives there. She walks to Netherfields to look after her sister and then later goes there again on social occasions. So people in Jane Austen novels really aren't isolated within their homes at all. Sense and Sensibility is all about displacement. It's all about being forced out of the home that you know and love into a new situation. The Dashwood sisters have to get used to these new, more modest surroundings and circumstances while still navigating the society around them. They don't stay put in their cottage. Persuasion has a similar theme of sort of domestic discomfort and displacement and being forced out of your home and having to find yourself in new surroundings and be okay with that. Mansfield Park, I guess, could be considered Jane Austen's most domestic novel because most of the book is set at Mansfield Park, which is the main character's home. But even then, it isn't her real home. She's never made to feel like she belongs there. And there's also a very striking part at the end of the book where the main character travels to Southampton, where she is displaced not just geographically but also socially. And the scenes set at Fanny Price's parents' kind of shabby townhouse in Southampton are some of the most vivid descriptions of place that I remember from Austen. And they're certainly some of the most memorable parts of the book. So Jane Austen is not about domestic comfort at all. In every book she throws her characters into new situations, into new places, and it's true that the drama, the conflict, the plot, the friction of Jane Austen's novels happens in the parlour, in the drawing room and in the music room, but it's very rarely in the familiar drawing room that the protagonists are comfortable with and that they know and that they can call home. Homes overall are important in Jane Austen. We readers feel a sense of belonging to these places, not necessarily the main characters' homes, but the large stately homes that we get descriptions of in the books, like the idyllic setting of Mansfield Park, that is just not made comfortable for Fanny Price, that even though she has spent almost all of her life there, she feels like a stranger. There is the perfection of Pemberley, the sight of which gets Elizabeth all excited about that guy she didn't like just a few pages previously. There is the sort of intimidating opulence of Rosings Park, also from Pride and Prejudice, that tells us so much about the character of Lady Catherine de Bourgh before we even get to know her. Jane Austen makes the home an important part of her narratives. It's a bit of a cliche to say that the setting is just another character in the books, but in her books it is often true. And through the setting we have a stage for these conflicts to take place. And because all of Jane Austen's novels are about women, and women in her time were confined in a way to these domestic spaces, it makes sense that we think of Jane Austen as a domestic author. And I also want to make sure that I don't think we should use the word domestic as a pejorative, as a belittling term for a novel. Jane Austen elevates the mundane setting of the home and makes it into the stage and an important player in the conflict that her characters have to deal with within her stories. But it isn't the comfort of the home that attracts us to her stories, but it is the strangeness of the homes that these characters move about in. Imagine Pride and Prejudice. I'm going to use this as an example because that is presumably the Jane Austen novel that most people are familiar with. Now imagine the entire novel set at Longbourn. Imagine if the Bennet family were in fact in lockdown. Nothing would happen. It wouldn't be a novel. It would just be Mary practicing the piano and Lydia and Kitty stitching up some bonnets and Elizabeth and Jane reading a book and Mrs. Bennet complaining about her nerves and Mr. Bennet stuck in his library. There is no story there. The story in Jane Austen's novels comes from movement, and it comes from the characters finding themselves in strange surroundings. And that's why I've been baffled by a lot of these comparisons that I have seen. Because yes, on the one hand you can say that the new movement of domestic employments, such as needlework and crochet and knitting, all of which I love, by the way, as I'm sure you can tell, I just don't think that that is what makes Jane Austen's novels great, and I don't think that that is the distinguishing factor of her novels. When I think of domesticity in Jane Austen, I don't think of scenes of Elizabeth embroidering a cushion or anything like that. That is just not the driving force of her novels. Let me know your thoughts down below. I'd be interested to see what you make of these comparisons between our current lockdown situation and the characters in Jane Austen novels. I want to point you towards one video I did last year on a slightly, I mean not really the same theme, but I guess an adjacent topic, which is music in Pride and Prejudice. One of the most commonly described activities in Jane Austen's novels that people perform, that women perform in the home, is playing music, playing the piano, playing the harp. And I made a video last year analysing the way that music is used in a Pride and Prejudice specifically. So if you are into Pride and Prejudice, check out that video. And I also want to point you towards another video that I did very recently, in which I talk about a conduct book of Jane Austen's time, in which the author of this conduct book, which is written for governesses, gives some very strange life advice. Both of those will be linked in the description box as well. So check them out if you want more Jane Austen Regency domestic content. Thank you for watching. Bye!